paradise of Puerto Rico is a favorite vacation destination for many Americans, but for the people who call it home, it's anything but a holiday. Crippled by debt, the territory of the United States is in the middle of a financial crisis with no help in sight. Coming up, we'll talk to a former governor of Puerto Rico, but first, CCTV's Nitza Soledad Perez explains how the island found itself in this situation.
Puerto Rico is on the brink of default. In June, the government announced it simply cannot pay $72 billion in debt.
Puerto Rico needs, and I propose today, a complete and comprehensive restructuring and development plan that is not short-term, but long-term, and is definitive for the immense problem today that we face.
Economists point to several reasons for Puerto Rico's debt crisis, including the island's municipal debt per capita, which is huge. There have been years of financial mismanagement, an oil-dependent energy sector, and a failure to develop its tourism industry. Plus, there were major job losses in 2006 when Congress phased out tax incentives for U.S. companies operating on the island. When facing its own economic troubles, the U.S. city of Detroit filed for bankruptcy. But that's one thing Puerto Rico cannot do, since it's not a U.S. city. U.S. bankruptcy law makes no provision for a territory or a U.S. state to declare bankruptcy. Now, there are calls for Washington to make changes to the laws to include Puerto Rico.
It is the moment for us, in one voice, to demand concrete action from Washington. Action from Washington now. Action so that they can finish approving the changes to Chapter 9, so that Puerto Rico can count on the same protection that other jurisdictions have.
The White House is not planning to come to Puerto Rico's rescue anytime soon.
There's no one in the administration or in D.C. that's contemplating a federal bailout of Puerto Rico. But we do remain committed to working with Puerto Rico and their leaders as they address the serious financial challenges that are currently plaguing the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico.
With all the turmoil, Puerto Ricans are leaving the island at unprecedented levels, close to 50,000 per year.
That's another major concern because, of course, Social Security systems, Medicare, retirement pensions all depend on the entrance of new, younger members of the labor force, and in fact, that's one of the areas that's been affected by the situation, as many of the migrants are also between the ages of 18 and 44.
Puerto Rico is not allowed to file bankruptcy or get some kind of bailout. The government says default is imminent, as well as a mass migration of its citizens to the mainland U.S., pushing its economy even deeper into a rot. Nitza Soledad Perez, CCTV, Miami.
To give us the inside perspective on the island's financial situation, we have Luis Fortuno, former governor of Puerto Rico and resident commissioner for the island in the U.S. Congress. Governor, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let me start by asking you, how did Puerto Rico get into this situation in the first place?
Sure. The economy has been underperforming, I will say, for the last 15, 20 years. Actually, in the last 10 years, the economy has only been in positive territory for a period of 18 months between 2011 and 2012. As a result of that, Puerto Rico tried to get the economy going, and one of the alternatives was to incur into deficit spending and, of course, the financing of the deficit, which certainly is not a wise policy at all.
So you had no economic growth, but the borrowing continued.
Exactly, which, again, makes no sense. The government has been too large for the size of the economy, and it's the weight for paying for that is just too onerous on the population.
How did it get to $72 billion? I mean, that might be much money in terms of the American economy, but it's a substantial amount in terms of Puerto Rico's economy.
Puerto Rico has 17 different types of credits or bonds that have been issued. So not only are there general obligation bonds, which are issued by the territory, but then there are other bonds that are issued by public corporations that depend, for example, the Power Authority, and they pay those bonds based on what people pay for power. The Water Authority, same thing, where they pay for water and sewer, and so on and so forth. So you're adding up a lot of services that in many other places are in private hands.
The current governor, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, he said this. He said the past administration could deal with these problems by sweeping them under a rug, leaving the solutions for later and taking out more loans. He was, of course, referring to your administration there. And your response to that would be what?
Well, I don't engage in partisan politics at all, but I believe the market knows better. During our tenure, the bond rating agencies increased the bond rating 2 notches. So far, the bond rating has gone down in the last 31 months 13 times. The cost of borrowing went down dramatically. Actually, there was a difference when I came into office of 165 basis points, over 1.5% in the cost of borrowing in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis the states. When I left, it was basically even. And the economy, the only growth we have seen was during 2 of those 4 years. Actually, when I came into office, what is happening today should have happened. And what I did was I flew to New York before being sworn in. I met with the rating agencies. I met with the institutional investors. I told them what we were going to do. And I did something that is not politically expeditious, but it's the right thing to do. We slashed expenses by 20%. As a result of that, we brought in under control that deficit. We started bringing down taxes. And again, the economy, for the first time in many years, went into positive territory. I respect other opinions. And for example, the fiscal policy changed dramatically with the change in administrations. First year, costs went up 10%. And I wonder how many businesses or governments can increase expenses from 1 year to the next by 10%.
But I'm wondering what happened to the borrowings. I mean, if I put this really simply, I mean, you borrow the money, you invest it, you hope that these investments work out and you generate more money.
Well, during my tenure, 94% of the borrowing went to pay all invoices, to pay vendors that were owed a lot of money and to cover the deficit, which at the time represented 44% of revenue, being by far the largest deficit in the country, proportionally speaking. So again, I wish I had the luxury of using that borrowing for those purposes. We used it to meet our obligations and to avoid closing down the government at the time.
Governor Padilla is also calling the current debt, $72 billion, as I've pointed out, unpayable.
I beg to disagree in the following. There are 17 different types of credits. For example, the general obligation bonds, the ones that are issued by the territorial government, that is a fraction of that amount, and that is protected by the state constitution. That means that the state constitution states that you first have to pay those bondholders, those obligations, before you pay anything else. Sales taxes. There are bonds issued that are based on the sales tax collections. And actually that money that is collected from sales taxes goes into a lockbox mechanism. Right. Those can be paid. There are others that perhaps cannot be paid and should be restructured. So I would have a more nuanced approach to this.
Now, there's a bill which is being considered right now to allow the territory to file for bankruptcy. Is that one of the solutions?
I don't think it's a solution. It is a stopgap mechanism to allow for some certainty in a process that anyhow is not a pleasant process anyway. Right. It would not allow the territorial government to file for bankruptcy. What I would do is that it will allow those public corporations or other entities, just in the same way that in the 50 states, to file for bankruptcy for reorganization. However, I must say that there was traction in the United States Congress when this bill was being discussed. And then when the administration in Puerto Rico announced that it would not live up to its obligations, everything stopped on its tracks, and this has thrown a monkey wrench into the process, and I'm not sure what the end result will be.
Right, in the best case scenario, and we're also looking at what is legal here and what are the legal obligations of the federal government, what would you want? Well,
the underlying problem here is lack of growth. I would say that without the economy growing, there's no way for Puerto Rico to get out of this one. For example, the solution in the last 31 months has been to raise expenses and raise taxes dramatically, and that has killed the economy. And the economy has been in a free fall for 31 consecutive months. But by the same token, I must say that because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, it's not a state. It's very similar to a state. It is not a foreign country from the perspective of the United States. Puerto Rico does not fully participate, not just politically, but also economically, in every sense of the word, in every program, whether it's infrastructure or social program. And that has to be addressed.
And I suppose the key difference here is that at this stage, the territory cannot or does not have access to the courts to seek relief.
Exactly. And what will happen, the alternative actually is, if you cannot meet your obligations, will be a free-for-all type of litigation where only lawyers, and I'm a lawyer so I can say that, only lawyers will gain.
Is this, and I've heard this comparison being made, is this a Greek crisis in the Caribbean?
I would say no, although there's some similarities. But for example, the debt, Puerto Rico's debt, total debt, is high, but still 100% of the economy. In Greece, it's over 250% of the economy. Secondly, Greece is an independent republic. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. So there are differences, and the rule of law in terms of how things are done in the United States rule in Puerto Rico, whereas in Greece there are some regulations imposed by the EU, and on the other hand they have their own laws as well. So there are differences, but however both certainly are difficult, and getting out of this problem is not nice in either of the situation.
Will we see serious austerity measures being implemented?
Well, that's what has been lacking in the last 31 months. Again, when you increase expenses, I'll give you an example. Since 2012, the number of students in the public education system has come down by 45,000. Yet there are more than 5,000 additional teachers. I believe in having one teacher per student if you could afford it, but you can't. There's no way you can pay for that, certainly. And that's just one of many examples where we all wish that things were different, but money is finite, and you cannot just spend it like there's no tomorrow.
Right. We have two Democrat senators in the U.S. Congress who are trying to introduce legislation to correct the situation in Greece. They are warning if this is not fixed, Puerto Rico could face a humanitarian crisis.
Well, it's interesting because since Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory, we are natural-born American citizens, which means that Puerto Ricans just hop on a plane and fly to Florida, for example, for $99 one way, and they can just move in, start working, because we are American citizens. So what has happened, and I was verifying, and before coming here, verifying some recent numbers, in the last 18 months, the rate of people doing that has tripled. So it is already occurring. Not that it may occur, it's happening already.
Well, we've got, what, 50,000 people a year moving now?
Yes, which is unbelievable. It used to be around 15.
Why didn't Puerto Rico adopt economic plans in the past that would have generated growth?
Well, there have been moments of growth in Puerto Rico, but there are some natural barriers to it. For example, in an island, you have to ship almost everything in and out. There's no way around it. If you're in a continent, you can truck it, or you can use a train service. Not in Puerto Rico. And in the United States, there's what's called the Jones Act. And the Jones Act requires that any transshipment between two U.S. ports, and that includes ports in Puerto Rico because we are part of the U.S., have to be done on U.S.-made vessels with U.S. personnel. That adds a lot to the cost of operations of any sorts. So, but there have been moments of growth, and the last one exactly it was in 2011, 2012, although it was tepid growth, but so was the case in the U.S. mainland. There was tepid growth at the time as well, not 4 or 5%, but still there was growth. So Puerto Rico has in the past implemented some policies, but there are some issues that have to be addressed.
What about ordinary Puerto Ricans? How are they being affected by this crisis?
All my family live in Puerto Rico. So to me, this is personal, and to many of us that reside in the U.S. mainland. And I can tell you that life is becoming more and more difficult every day and every week. And that's why it has to be addressed in one way or another. Not just with the proper policies, not just fiscal, but other policies implemented locally in Puerto Rico. But Washington also has to turn to it and see how can it do better. For example, we participate in the Medicaid program, which in the U.S. covers anyone who is under the poverty level for obtain medical attention. In Puerto Rico, the state has to bear 50% of the cost, whereas in Mississippi, which is the poorest state, the state covers only 17% of the cost, and the federal government covers the rest. So there are differences that have to be addressed, and they could be addressed. One way would be to become a state, and that this will be addressed immediately.
Okay, that's another political question.
Yes.
But when you say life is difficult, I mean, do people have access to public services? Are they still running?
Yes, still. Although there hasn't been yet to this moment non-payment of any of the debt. That may commence come August. There are certain payments that are due in August. The ones that were due in July were paid, but the government has already indicated that some of those that are coming up in August may not get paid.
Right.
The moment there's a non-payment in any of these 17 different types of bonds, there'll be lawsuits. And this is they will create a snowball effect that will actually spiral out of control. And at the same time, the government is facing a liquidity crunch, so there's no access to the market to borrow at any cost. This could begin becoming more and more difficult, certainly.
So we have a situation now where you have a fix or you have a default. Where's Puerto Rico going to go?
Well, I certainly hope, again, and I love my island and the people there, and as I mentioned earlier, my family lives down there. I certainly hope that the proper policies, both in Puerto Rico and in Washington, will be implemented to avert a crisis.